They were prepared to accept hunger, shortage, and waiting because those were the conditions they had learned to associate with defeat and captivity. But what they were not prepared for was the quiet realization that food, just beyond their reach, did not appear to be scarce at all. From a distance, they began to notice shelves that did not empty, packages that were replaced as soon as they disappeared, and a routine that suggested abundance rather than control. And this contradiction unsettled them far more than hunger ever had. Because once they understood that food existed in excess outside the camp, the meaning of captivity itself began to change in ways they had never imagined. When German prisoners of war first arrived in the United States, they carried with them assumptions formed long before their capture, assumptions shaped by years of deprivation, collapsing supply lines, ration cards that grew stricter with every passing month, and a civilian population that had learned to stretch meals until there was nothing left to stretch. By the time many of them were taken prisoner, hunger was no longer an emergency, but a condition of life, something expected rather than feared, and this experience quietly defined what captivity was supposed to mean in their minds, even before they understood where they were being sent. They believed that defeat would naturally lead to scarcity, not necessarily as punishment, but as a simple continuation of wartime reality. Because in their experience, food had become inseparable from power, control, and survival, and those who lost wars rarely ate well afterward. Inside the camps, daily routines reinforced this expectation. As meals arrived on schedule, portions were measured, and eating became part of an orderly system designed to remove uncertainty rather than create comfort, which made sense to men who had lived under constant regulation for years. Although the food itself was often more regular than what they had known during the final stages of the war, it was still interpreted through the lens of captivity, meaning that any adequacy was assumed to be temporary, conditional, and easily withdrawn if circumstances changed. What they did not anticipate was that the first cracks in this assumption would not come from the food they were given, but from the food they were never meant to receive, because it was the outside world that quietly contradicted everything they believed about wartime scarcity. During work assignments beyond the camp fences, transport details, or moments when guards spoke casually among themselves, references began to surface that did not align with the prisoners' expectations, including mentions of stock stores, routine shopping, and meals that did not depend on careful planning or substitution. At first, these observations were easy to dismiss because exaggeration seemed more plausible than abundance, especially for men who had seen entire cities reduced to rubble and supply chains collapse under constant bombardment. Yet the repetition of these small details gradually made dismissal impossible, because the same descriptions appeared again and again, not as isolated exceptions, but as normal aspects of civilian life, suggesting that scarcity was not universal, but unevenly distributed across the world. This realization introduced an unexpected tension, because it forced the prisoners to confront the idea that hunger was not an unavoidable consequence of war everywhere, but a condition shaped by distance, industrial capacity, and geography, factors that had spared the American mainland from the destruction they knew so well. As this understanding settled in, captivity began to feel less like a simple extension of defeat and more like a boundary separating two completely different realities, one defined by limitation and the other by continuity, and it was within this contrast that their earliest doubts began to take root. Many people who enjoy these stories watch on television. Subscribing helps make sure the next story appears automatically. As time passed and the routines of captivity settled into something predictable, the contrast between life inside the camp and the world beyond its boundaries became increasingly difficult for the prisoners to ignore, because what they were beginning to notice did not appear dramatic or staged, but ordinary in a way that felt deeply unsettling to men shaped by years of scarcity. During work details assigned outside the camp, particularly those involving roads, farms, rail lines, or nearby towns, the prisoners found themselves exposed to brief but repeated glimpses of civilian life that contradicted everything they believed war had done to the world. Trucks moved regularly, carrying supplies that did not appear guarded or rationed, and deliveries arrived with a consistency that suggested replacement rather than conservation. They noticed that shops remained open, their windows displaying goods without signs warning of shortage or emergency, and that civilians moved through these spaces without the cautious behavior that had become second nature back home. Packages were carried openly, food was handled casually, and conversations about meals did not carry the weight of calculation or concern that the prisoners associated with survival. At first, these observations were interpreted cautiously because disbelief offered a form of protection. It was easier to assume exaggeration, misunderstanding, or selective exposure than to accept that such scenes could represent normal life during wartime. Many convinced themselves that what they were seeing must be temporary, perhaps the result of stockpiling or limited to specific regions chosen for appearance rather than reality. Yet these explanations began to lose their power as the same scenes repeated themselves day after day. The trucks returned. The shops remained stocked. The civilians continued their routines without visible strain. Nothing about these patterns suggested urgency or impending collapse, and nothing in the behavior of guards indicated that such visibility was unusual or sensitive. Inside the camp, this growing awareness had no outlet. The prisoners did not receive explanations, and no effort was made to address or contextualize what they were witnessing. Guards did not discourage observation, nor did they clarify it. The system remained silent, allowing the contrast to exist without guidance, which forced each man to process it individually. This silence proved more disturbing than denial ever could, because it left the prisoners alone with a realization they had not prepared for, namely that scarcity, which had defined their lives for years, was not a universal condition of the war. The possibility that abundance could exist elsewhere challenged not only their understanding of captivity, but their understanding of fairness, sacrifice, and shared hardship. Some began to reflect quietly on what this meant for those still at home, imagining families stretching rations while entire store shelves existed elsewhere untouched. Others focused on the psychological distance this created, as though the world they had known was no longer aligned with the one continuing beyond the wire. Over time, these thoughts altered how the prisoners interpreted their own situation. Captivity no longer felt defined solely by what they lacked, but by what they could see without accessing, a separation that carried its own form of strain. The camp became a boundary not just of movement, but of experience, dividing two realities that no longer seemed connected by the same rules. As this awareness deepened, the prisoners began to understand that what unsettled them was not envy or desire, but contradiction. War, as they had known it, was supposed to impose limits on everyone equally. What they were witnessing suggested otherwise, and that idea lingered quietly, reshaping their perception of both captivity and the world they believed they understood. As the realization settled that abundance existed just beyond the boundaries of the camp, the prisoners began to experience a subtle shift that did not express itself through anger or protest, but through a growing sense of distance from the world they believed they understood. What troubled them was not simply that civilians ate better than soldiers, but that this difference appeared normal, accepted, and unremarkable to everyone except those watching from behind the wire. Inside the camp, daily life continued with its familiar structure. Meals arrived on schedule, work assignments were carried out, and the presence of guards remained steady and unchanging. Nothing in the routine acknowledged the contrast the prisoners were now aware of, and nothing suggested that their observations required explanation. The system functioned as though the outside world did not exist, even while allowing it to remain visible. This indifference forced the prisoners to confront a difficult adjustment. They had been conditioned to believe that hardship was shared, that sacrifice was collective, and that deprivation was an unavoidable consequence of war. The scenes they observed challenged this belief quietly but persistently, suggesting that suffering was not evenly distributed and that distance from destruction mattered more than allegiance or sacrifice. Some men attempted to suppress these thoughts, focusing instead on the predictability of camp life, because predictability offered stability, even if it lacked meaning. Others found that the contrast followed them into moments of rest, shaping their reflections during quiet hours when routine no longer demanded attention. The idea that life elsewhere continued without the same constraints became increasingly difficult to dismiss. What made this realization particularly unsettling was its lack of resolution. There was no moment of confrontation, no explanation offered, and no event that clarified why this disparity existed. The prisoners were left with awareness, but no context, observation without understanding. This combination created a form of psychological strain that differed from hunger or fear because it could not be addressed through endurance alone. As days passed, the distance between their experience and the world beyond the wire began to feel less like a physical separation and more like a conceptual one. The prisoners no longer felt connected to civilian life as something they might eventually rejoin unchanged. Instead, it began to feel distant, governed by rules and conditions they had not lived under for years. This sense of separation altered how the men thought about their own place in the war. Captivity was no longer defined solely by loss of freedom, but by exclusion from a reality that continued independently of their suffering. The war they had known, marked by scarcity and constant adjustment, no longer appeared to be the same war experienced by those whose lives unfolded without visible shortage. Over time, the effort to reconcile these two realities gave way to a quieter acceptance that they might never fully understand the disparity. The prisoners did not stop noticing the contrast, but they stopped expecting it to make sense. The world beyond the wire became something observed from a distance, not questioned and not integrated into their understanding of fairness or sacrifice. In this way, captivity reshaped not only their daily routines, but their perception of the war itself. The realization that civilians could live without the constraints they had endured did not provoke rebellion or despair, but it introduced a lasting sense of disconnection, one that lingered quietly as the camp routines continued unchanged. What deepened the prisoners' sense of disconnection was not only what they could see beyond the wire, but the complete absence of response from the system that governed their daily lives, because authority, as they had known it before, usually revealed itself through reaction, correction, or explanation. Here, however, nothing changed, and that silence carried more weight than any spoken rule ever could. The guards continued their routines with the same measured consistency they applied to every aspect of camp life. Work details were assigned, movements were supervised, and order was maintained without visible tension or adjustment. There were no warnings about what could be observed, no attempts to redirect attention, and no effort to frame the contrast between scarcity inside the camp and abundance beyond it. The system neither concealed reality nor explained it. It simply allowed it to exist. In environments the prisoners had known before, information itself had been treated as something to be controlled, shaped, and rationed as carefully as food. Here, visibility appeared irrelevant. The guards did not behave as though the presence of stocked stores or well-supplied civilians threatened order or discipline. Their indifference suggested that understanding was not required for captivity to function. This lack of reaction unsettled the prisoners more than restriction ever could. They had been conditioned to expect limits to tighten when awareness increased, to anticipate punishment or withdrawal once contradictions became obvious. Instead, nothing followed. The same routes were taken on work details. The same scenes remained visible. The system absorbed their awareness without altering its behavior. Over time, this indifference reshaped how the prisoners interpreted authority itself. Power no longer appeared to operate through denial or enforcement alone, but through consistency that rendered interpretation unnecessary. The guards did not need to correct assumptions or manage belief, because routine continued regardless of what the prisoners understood. Some men initially expected that access to the outside world would be reduced, that routes would change, or tasks would be reassigned to limit exposure. When this did not happen, they were forced to reconsider what captivity was meant to achieve. Control, it seemed, did not depend on isolating prisoners from reality, but on confining them within a structure that did not respond to awareness. This realization altered the meaning of resistance. There was nothing to oppose and nothing to challenge in the familiar sense. The prisoners could not argue with what they saw, nor could they demand explanation from a system that offered none. Silence became a boundary as firm as the wire itself. As days passed, the men began to accept that the contrast between inside and outside would remain unresolved. The system showed no intention of bridging that gap or addressing its implications. Captivity functioned independently of understanding, relying on routine rather than persuasion. By allowing abundance to exist in plain sight without comment, the camp reinforced a quiet truth. Confusion did not weaken control. In some ways, it strengthened it because it forced the prisoners to adapt internally without resolution. The system did not ask them to believe anything. It required only that they continue to live within its boundaries, regardless of what they now knew. As the weeks passed, and the contrast between life inside the camp and the world beyond the wire remained unchanged, the prisoners began to experience a shift that was not marked by resolution or understanding, but by quiet accommodation. What had once demanded constant mental effort slowly lost its urgency, not because it made sense, but because repetition made questioning exhausting. The stores beyond the fence continued to appear full. Civilians continued their routines without visible concern. Deliveries arrived, shelves were replenished, and nothing in the surrounding world suggested emergency or collapse. Inside the camp, routines continued with the same consistency, unaffected by what the prisoners now knew. Together, these two realities settled into a fixed relationship that no longer provoked reaction. This normalization did not bring comfort. Instead, it altered how the prisoners experienced time and meaning. Days began to feel less defined by moments of discovery or contradiction and more by steady repetition, where observation no longer carried the weight it once had. The effort to reconcile what they saw with what they believed gradually gave way to a quieter acceptance that reconciliation was not possible. For some prisoners, this shift produced emotional distance. The war, once experienced as an all-consuming struggle marked by scarcity and sacrifice, began to feel abstract, as though it belonged to a different world operating under different conditions. For others, the contrast reinforced a sense of separation, creating the impression that their suffering existed in parallel to a reality that did not acknowledge it. What made this adjustment particularly subtle was its lack of visible expression. There were no confrontations, no changes in behavior, and no outward signs of protest. The prisoners did not speak openly about what they saw, not because it was forbidden, but because repetition had rendered discussion unnecessary. The contrast no longer required explanation. It simply existed. Over time, the prisoners learned to navigate this awareness without engaging it directly. The world beyond the wire became something observed rather than interpreted, a constant presence that neither intruded upon daily routine nor offered clarity. It remained visible, unchanged, and distant, reinforcing the sense that captivity was defined as much by exclusion as by confinement. This acceptance did not resolve the psychological strain introduced by the contrast. Instead, it transformed it. The tension shifted from active confusion to passive detachment, allowing the prisoners to continue their routines without constantly revisiting questions that had no answers. In this way, adaptation replaced understanding. By the time this process was complete, the abundance they once found unsettling had lost its ability to shock. It had become part of the landscape of captivity, not as something understood or justified, but as something endured through familiarity. The system had not required the prisoners to accept its logic. It had simply waited for repetition to do its work. And so, the most powerful change did not occur outside the wire, but within the prisoners themselves. The contrast between scarcity and abundance remained, unresolved and unexplained, yet it no longer demanded reaction. It existed quietly, shaping perception without force, and preparing the ground for a captivity defined not by what was taken away, but by what could be seen and never reached. For the men held behind the wire, captivity in America came to be defined not only by what they lacked, but by what they could observe without ever being able to enter. The world beyond the fences continued to function under conditions that did not reflect the scarcity they had known, and that contrast lingered quietly, reshaping how they understood both the war and their own place within it. What unsettled them most was not abundance itself, but its indifference. Stores remained stocked without explanation. Civilians moved through daily life without visible urgency. Supplies were replaced as easily as they disappeared, and nothing in the structure of captivity acknowledged this disparity or attempted to explain it away. The system allowed reality to exist without commentary, leaving the prisoners to adjust without context. Over time, the effort to question and interpret these observations became heavier than the observations themselves. Repetition replaced curiosity, and familiarity dulled the sharp edges of contradiction. The prisoners learned to live alongside a reality that did not align with their experience, accepting that understanding was neither offered nor required. In this environment, captivity revealed itself as something more complex than deprivation or punishment. It was defined by separation, by proximity to a world that continued without them, and by the psychological distance created when two realities existed side by side without intersection. The war they had lived through, marked by shortage and constant adaptation, no longer appeared to be the same war unfolding beyond the wire. The stores full of food were never meant to send a message or teach a lesson. They were simply there, part of a world that operated under different conditions and followed different rules. And in their quiet presence, they forced the prisoners to confront a truth that could not be resolved, only endured. By the time this realization fully settled, the contrast between scarcity and abundance no longer demanded explanation. It remained visible, unchanged, and distant, shaping memory and perception long after the routines of captivity continued on their steady, unbroken course. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.